Welcome to the King of Games 98! On this episode, it's Metal Gear Solid versus Grim Fandango.
Welcome back everyone to another episode of the King of Games 1998, a tournament in which we are ruthless in letting the games released in 1998 maul each other to death. It's a game-eat-game world in here, but it's all for a good cause, namely, finding out which game released in 1998 is the fittest of them all. As usual, there will be 3 of us judging these games based on 4 criteria: our personal experience, the critical and sales reception, whether the game had a lasting legacy or whether it was genre-defining, and ultimately, how do these games fare against each other head-to-head. So my name is Ozzy, and I will be steering the discussion today, but will also be a juror as well. And I am very excited about this episode because it has a bit of an old world flavor, as my 2 other jurors are in continental Europe. Hailing from the United Kingdom, but residing in the Netherlands, we have Geoff Ivats.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hey. And we are excited to bring back from the land of beer, sausage, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It is our dear friend Dennis Strillinger, or if you go by his nom de plume, Strillivanilli. How are you, Strilly?
Hello, this is Sleepy Herman the Creepy German. How are you guys?
I'm doing much better now that I hear you. So we're actually doing this episode at a very unusual time. Usually we record it in the mornings Eastern time, so that would be New York time. So that would be the afternoon for Strilly and for Geoff. But right now we're actually recording quite late at night, and Dennis is a little bit sleep deprived, so he might be a little bit rambly. He might say things that are not so appropriate. So let's just give him a pass. He has a young kid, doesn't let him sleep. It's not getting much sleep lately. But hopefully that gives this episode a very different type of energy. I always like these episodes recorded later in the day because they always feel just a little bit different. And on this episode, we're still in the round of 8, and we have Grim Fandango going up against Metal Gear Solid. And boy, am I glad to be on this episode. Just to recap, on our previous episode, Metal Gear Solid took down Banjo-Kazooie, although it was touch and go for a moment there as Arnie took forever to decide the tie-breaking vote. And then we have Grim Fandango. Almost as if out of spite, Grim Fandango, if you recall, previously faced StarCraft. And you would think that the game that an entire country went crazy over, that had its own TV channels, that is still being played competitively to this day, and that was one of the best examples of the strategy genre, would have prevailed, but no. That was not the case, as Arnie cast the vote in favor of Grim Fandango in what was probably the biggest upset of the round of 16 and busting every bracket with it. Harsh words were said, severe punishments were meted out, and to this day, I only speak with Arnie through my co-host. But perhaps this episode can go some way into making things right. In other words, all goal here is to bring balance to the force. So, With that said, let us just have a quick summary of each game. Metal Gear Solid, everyone knows it. It is a stealth game written and directed by the man and the legend Hideo Kojima that was released for the PlayStation in North America on October 21, 1998. Remember, we're just using the North American dates here. I know Europe, but you usually release very late, so we can't take you into account. This would be the Battle of 1999 otherwise. And Grim Fandango, on the other hand, is an adventure game written and directed by Tim Schafer, he of Double Fine Productions fame, that was released just 9 days after Metal Gear Solid on October 30th, 1998. And Metal Gear Solid was published by Konami and eventually became a multi-million-selling franchise. And Grim Fandango was released by LucasArts in the waning days of the adventure game genre and never received a sequel. So that makes for a very interesting matchup, which should be very interesting. And to get us started, let us start with you, Dennis. What is your experience with Grim Fandango?
Grim Fandango I played, I think, pretty early after release, because me as a kid was a huge point-and-click adventure fan. I started off my gaming career on the Commodore 64, and this led to me playing games like Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. So those games really shaped me and my gaming taste. And then came games like Indiana Jones and Day of the Tentacle, Monkey Island, of course. And I was just obsessed with the intricate stories those games would convey, because other games, conventional games, so to say, just had like one quick juxtaposition. You're a space guy shooting aliens or whatever. And those games were like movies. That was incredible and loved it. And I also loved the humor. They really shaped my personal kind of humor. So, for me, it was just natural to play Grim Fandango pretty much right away.
And did you remember looking forward to this game, or did you know that it was going to release before it came out?
To be quite frank, I really can't recall if I was like super looking forward to it, because the hype that is being generated for upcoming game releases, as it is nowadays through social media and internet, that of course was not the case for back in the day. We had magazines. In our day and age, we had magazines on printed paper. So all those youngsters, if you don't know what it is, printed paper.
Nani?
Nani?
We were killing trees one magazine at a time back in those days, and we didn't care.
Fuck the hippies. Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, it was crazy. I really loved that, actually. That was a thing that I was looking forward to each month, receiving my subscription favorite video game magazine and reading it front to back, every single word, minus FIFA or any other sports related games. But I was really into that, and I really sorry for that, everyone. I really sat down and listened, read all the articles and soaked in all the information. But I probably read through those about Grim Fandango and then was going to or maybe I had there I am already rambling about starting 3 sentences in a row and never finishing any. Sorry. I had this one video game store that I was a regular at. And he was basically my main source of new release titles. When I dropped into the store wanting to rent a video game for the weekend, he would say, "Hey, Dennis, this game is going to come out soon. Do you want to pre-order it?" Or something like that. And I think he probably made me aware of it.
Oh, nice. And so did you actually play it contemporaneously when it came out?
Yes, but I didn't finish it.
Okay, but did you get quite far, or was it just that you got stuck on one of the puzzles or one of the sections?
I think I got stuck, and I probably had other games that were more interesting to me at that time. I mean, it was 1998 and there were some major games coming out that year. So I think it was just something like along the lines of, hey, I got stuck in this puzzle and I'm just not eager enough to play this, to go through this puzzle. I'm just going to play something else because Ocarina of Time or whatever, or Resident Evil 2 came out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, Geoff, what was your experience with Grim Fandango?
My experience with Grim Fandango started about a week ago. No, it's a really short-lived love affair between me and Grim. Back in '98, I think Strilly, he just mentioned one of the games close to my heart, Resident Evil 2.
Same.
I was spending most of the late '90s playing PlayStation. I knew about Grim Fandango. I think all of us are fully into, I guess, LucasArts games. I mean, I don't want to repeat what Shirley said, but yeah, Monkey Island and The Day of the Tentacle were two of my favorite games in the 90s on the PC.
Yeah.
But at that time, around 97, 98 was when I was really diverting towards console gaming. So adventure games were starting to take, or point and click, or whatever you want to call them, they were starting to take a bit of a back seat. So I knew about Grim Fandango, also most likely because of magazines. But I hadn't really played it until the re-release, the remaster. And I think playing that, I did the first 2 to 3 puzzles, and it reminded me why I stepped away from those adventure games all those years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
It I really struggled to connect with it, but I have watched like the long plays just to get more of a sense of where it goes. So that's been my experience with Grim Fandango.
Yeah, they do require quite a bit of patience nowadays, and that's a patience that I don't think we necessarily have nowadays. Back in the day, maybe since you had to get the most out of your game, and there was less diversity, I would say, out there and options in terms of games, you kind of just had to stick through with it. And the benefit of time, kind of has not been kind to Grim Fandango or many of the adventure games for that sake. I mean, when you really think about the fact that LucasArts games were supposed to be, the common sense ones, the ones that had puzzles that actually did not, feel ridiculous, whereas Sierra Online were the ones that had that traditional kind of puzzle, logic, adventure game logic. And, when you go back to Grim Fandango, you kind of don't even realize that because it's still quite obtuse. The puzzles are still kind of, require a lot of just kind of clicking and going. And the other thing is just the movement. It feels so slow compared to what we're used to nowadays. But going back to not having played it earlier, I mean, one of the issues that you have with a game like Grim Fandango is that it was confined to its kind of Windows 98 release. And since it did not have a re-release until much later, it's kind of like the same with a game like the Blade Runner Westwood game, where the only way you could play it was if you actually, had a Windows XP PC or something like that. But if you were running Windows 7, or Windows 10, it's kind of hard to, be able to make that game work without some sort of coding savviness. So it's a good thing that the re-release brought it to a new audience. And just to kind of give you my experience, I don't have that much of an experience with Grim Fandango. I know more about it because of Tim Schafer. I know about it, because once I read about Psychonauts, I looked back and saw that, he had also done a game like Grim Fandango or Full Throttle. And so I love the aesthetics of it. I love the Day of the Dead look of the whole thing. But I never actually played it again, as with Geoff, until the remaster. So I'm coming into this with a little bit of fresh eyes. But in terms of Metal Gear Solid, Dennis, I'm pretty sure that you have some experience with it. What is your personal relationship with Metal Gear Solid?
I'm not sure. I don't think that I have played Metal Gear Solid right away after its release. I know exactly when I bought it myself, but I believe it was still in the PlayStation era, like when PlayStation was still around in the stores. It was not like I bought it later on. But I only got my PlayStation. I didn't get my PlayStation before 1999. But anyways, I was a Nintendo 64 kid, so I got that right away when it came out. I saved a lot of money and bought the console right away. And only got my PlayStation secondhand from a school buddy, like maybe 2 years afterwards. So that would be, that might have been 1997 or 1998. But then again, I didn't buy Metal Gear Solid right away. I bought it in a kind of double pack with with those extra missions that came out later.
Exactly.
The VR missions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
what did you think of it at the time?
I think, I think I did play it before I bought it because I got it, borrowed it from a friend or something. I was blown away by it because I have never played a game with this amount of tension building, espionage, spy, science fiction setting, and with voice acting the way that they had, along with all those codec messages and communications that you had in between. The cutscenes, the graphics were a little bit wishy-washy, but they were kind of like the style, so you didn't really have facial details, but that really was just the visual style, so that made it all the more mysterious and intriguing. So Metal Gear Solid blew me away, knocked me out of my socks, and I loved it from the first to the last second. It was incredible. So even looking back right now at it, realizing that the German dubbing is horrendous. It's really, it's a piece of work, really. And I have never played it in the original English dubbing. so I can't even compare. But
you have never played it in the original English?
No, because I only played the German game.
Okay.
And I never gotten
Ouch.
back to it to listen to the English version.
So this is interesting. What was so bad about the dubbing without going into too much of a digression?
It was just they had really bad voice actors, and it sounds like they had virtually no direction at all. So like there was no one telling them when to pronounce something in a specific way. So they probably didn't get the information. Hey, look, in the next take that we're going to record, you are being held at gunpoint, or you just saw that chick's ass, in that one stupid scene where the camera zooms in. So I don't know. It wasn't that bad because they kind of got everything from the context, I guess. But it's still with more direction and with better voice actors, it would have been even more massive. But it was good enough for everyone to love it. So I think that
it's a testament to the story and the gameplay that even with that bad dub, it still was appreciated in Germany.
Yes, exactly.
I did not know this before, but I also, I'm connecting one of the two together in terms of, you mentioned that back in the day, games did not have that much of a story. It's just, you had to fight space aliens or something like that. And that was the reason why, you like the adventure genre. But then, you get to 1998 and you're getting this similar, in-depth story from what would be considered in the past an action game. And so you could kind of technically see where things were going here, that the benefit of the adventure and the positives of the adventure game genre were being implemented into other genres and therefore kind of making it obsolete. So I don't know if I'm, outside of my norm here with this, but it seems like one of the two go together. So Geoff, what was your experience with Metal Gear Solid? I'm pretty sure that you're a huge fan.
Yeah, I am, and that's where I've got to probably get it out there earlier than towards the end when I suddenly reveal that I'm a big fan and vote
shocking
vote for
revelation.
Grim Fandango. I was hooked as soon as I got the demo disc from the PlayStation magazine. As soon as I had that, I don't think it left my console for a good week. I just replayed that over and over and over again. I got absolutely hopelessly addicted to it, and the hype for the release was incredible.
Geoff, how far did the demo go into the game? Up to which point?
Well, you see, so I've had some conversations with people where lots of people have got very different recollections of this. So in my mind, the demo that I played ended when you did the first real infiltration, when you were crawling to get into the base.
Yes, that's also what I recall.
Yeah,
because I believe I might have played the demo beforehand too. Now that you mention it.
Yeah. Well, my experience is similar to Geoff. I mean, I also played the demo, but my recollection is you actually make it into the bunker, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And that was it. But I mean, I played that demo over and over and over again until I eventually got it many years later. But I was so in love with it that it didn't matter that I was playing the same demo again and again. But it's definitely one of my favorite games of all times. I think that, I'm not being biased in the sense that, I have an unhealthy degree of bias with respect to Metal Gear Solid. It's a really excellent game that has stood the test of time quite well. And so I still hold it as probably the best Metal Gear Solid game, in the series. Maybe only compared to Metal Gear Solid 3. That's the only one that I think kind of really gives it a run for its money. But it's one of those experiences that everything makes sense. Everything that's added in there, it's in for the benefit of the story, for the benefit of the narrative, and for the benefit of improving the gameplay. It's very streamlined. There's not any fluff, really. There is,
exactly.
Even the coded conversations, they don't tend to overstay their welcome. They tend to just go for whatever amount of time, and it makes you feel like, you're part of this operation rather than, what you had in Metal Gear Solid 2, where you start discussing King Kong, like almost before the end of the game. So I think that it's a very tight experience, and what people don't remember is that it's actually quite a short experience. I mean, you could probably beat Metal Gear Solid in about 6 hours at most. It's not a very long game, particularly if you know what you're doing, but it's still just such a terrific, in its pacing. It has very good pacing. It never really feels like it drags on. And I think that that's really a testament to how well they were all firing under cylinders when they were creating this game. I don't think that they expected that this would be as big as it was, but I think that lack of expectation allowed them to be a little bit more restrained, but also adventurous, where it needed. So I think this is a phenomenal game. So, Geoff, what has been the reception to Metal Gear Solid in Europe, if you recall? Because, of course, the last episode, we kind of spoke about it from the US side in a way.
Okay, yeah.
But is it as well esteemed? Is it held in as high a regard as it is here in the States?
Well, I think the thing that says the most for me was, I remember back in the day, the official Nintendo magazine were obviously very worried about how good Metal Gear Solid was. They were so worried about it that they were publishing letters and making statements about how bad Metal Gear Solid is as a game.
That's
no way.
Childish. That's very childish.
And the official Nintendo magazine was in the UK was one of the most childish publications. The PlayStation was called the Grey Station, and the Dreamcast was called the Dream Pants.
That is absolutely dreadful. I mean, if you were still on board the Nintendo train after that, then you were just a masochist. Or 5.
So there was always that there's childish rivalry, but I think that says a lot, because when your direct competitor, when they're having to really kind of say bad things about a game which is clearly getting massive critical acclaim and success, that they know it's a good game. And it's obviously only until they got Twin Snakes did Nintendo fanboys suddenly say, hey, we've got Metal Gear Solid, isn't it amazing?
Yeah,
kind of thing. So for me, that said a lot within the gaming world, but it was definitely one of those games in my classroom where the guys and the girls maybe, but the guys especially who are on the periphery of video games, like they played FIFA basically, they were still interested in Metal Gear Solid as well as your typical gamer. So it definitely bridged a lot of people to kind of go, look, video games aren't just the latest copy of FIFA. There's also pretty much a cinema or movie experience, and that pulled in quite a lot of people. It didn't mean that they enjoyed it or they could play it, because it's still a bit of a difficult game to play if you're not adapt to video games. But I think that it brought in such a universal amount of different types of people towards the PlayStation that it really, really cemented in Europe anyway, that it was going to be something utterly phenomenal.
Yeah, and the other thing is that we all know that the PlayStation was huge in Europe. Europe, as a market, did not really have the same brand loyalty that the US and Japan had to Nintendo. Because before that, they had the Master System. They loved the Mega Drive, and the Mega Drive was, as much a competitor in Europe as any other, challenger that the Nintendo could have taken on. And then, the Nintendo 64 goes head to head with the PlayStation, and the PlayStation just eats its lunch. And so I imagine that means that Metal Gear Solid was kind of held, along with other games like Wipeout, as the game that shows that this is the console for adults. This is the console, that we Europeans like, in a sense. There wasn't the same sense of, the market crash, the video game market crash in 1984 in in Europe. And so it's not this kind of mythological perspective of Nintendo saved the industry. It's just oh yeah, Nintendo. I mean, I played with, the Super, NES or whatever. But it wasn't I need, to defend this console because it's intertwined with my identity as a gamer. And so that's why I think probably Metal Gear Solid was in a very good position to kind of really become one of the prominent figures in why PlayStation was, preferred. And Dennis, you talked about it a little bit, but, in Germany, is Metal Gear Solid still, perceived as, as a great game? Is it still talked about in a sense?
You mean the franchise or the original game?
Both the original game and the franchise.
Okay. Yes. It left a huge mark in the gaming industry, and it also left a pretty remarkable mark in the in the movie business, I would say, or in the rest of the media business, because people have been picking up on Hideo Kojima's name after Metal Gear Solid's release. He was like the first, after Shigeru Miyamoto, of course, I would say, at least from my perspective, as a huge Nintendo fanboy and Sega hater. Don't judge me, because I learned the better when I was older. Metal Gear Solid, yeah. Hideo Kojima, his name was in not everybody's mouths on everybody's names, but minds, but he was really being remembered as fondly as the game title itself. Because usually you would have you would have a movie title, and if it was a big and very prominent and popular director, then of course everybody would remember. Yeah, of course that's from Steven Spielberg, and that's from I don't know who. But in games, it just wasn't like that.
Well, and I think it's one of the games that actually started that trend of trying to really make video game experiences as filmic as possible.
Yeah.
And, there's a logical endpoint to that, which we saw with kind of like the Uncharted franchise, etc., which you get to a point where you say, well, up to what point is this so filmic that I'm kind of no longer playing the game? And we saw that with like QuickTime events. We saw that with, kind of those long cutscenes that would play out that made you feel like you're doing something, but at the same time, you're just kind of steering things forward without really having any agency. I think the difference is that Metal Gear Solid actually had a very tight gameplay component. And when you really think about it, Metal Gear Solid, what it is, it's literally almost like Pac-Man. If you really want to trace the lineage, you're kind of playing around the cone of vision and you're trying to make your way through the path in order to get to where you want to go. So there's an actual gameplay component, and it throws in just enough variation, with the different shaft grenades or the cameras or lasers, etc. All of those things make it feel like, oh, you're actually the super spy infiltrating this base in Alaska. And so the filmic component is not only because of, let's say, the cinematography itself, which it's one of the first games that actually had like cutscenes that you could say were cinematographic. But also the thematic component of it just felt like all the things that the gameplay did made it feel like you're playing a movie. So I don't know if you think that that's the case, Geoff.
Yeah, no, I was thinking it's a game that blended. It blends gameplay and cinematics seamlessly. I think that even though, Dennis mentioned earlier about you don't see the definition on people's faces, but the continuity is so strong that you very quickly look past that because it's all quite believable. And it never breaks. You never have that moment where you're taken out of the reality that the game's created. If you take other games that at the time where even Namco and Squaresofts were all thinking, okay, how great of an FMV can we make? But when you look back at it now, actually, a lot of those videos break that sense of immersion and of reality that the game world is set in. And actually, when you go back to Metal Gear Solid, it's so seamless. It really makes you feel like you're really involved in that world. And I think that with Metal Gear Solid, it has that right blend of gameplay versus cinematics. So we're saying it's a very simple title compared to its contemporaries. I recently completed a video game where the final blow of the main villain, so this was a Monster Boy, on the Switch. The final blow was done by an anime cinematic. And it's like, well, actually, I want to perform the final blow because I'm playing the game. I don't need a movie to deal the final blow on the main enemy. And Metal Gear Solid, you as Snake were doing all the actions. Yes, there's cutscenes, but you're still doing everything. The gameplay was really strong and consistent. So it's definitely a game where the amount of immersion is really considered, and I think that creates such a great, memorable experience in the gamer that you can replay it, but you're always getting an exciting experience from it.
Yeah, and there's also another element to this, which is that circa 1998, anime was having a moment. This was when anime was kind of really blowing up. And Metal Gear Solid is really a game that is very influenced by Hideo Kojima's taste and interest in anime. And you can kind of see Otacon being his stand-in, he's kind of a very, anime typical, stereotypical character, even though he's much more than that. But he's kind of Kojima's representation, within the game. And before this, you had, anime like Ghost in the Shell, you had Golgo 13, you had Cowboy Bebop. And this game kind of really fit within that time frame, and just a year later, well, not even a year later, just a few months later, we would see The Matrix release, which was another movie that was very influenced by anime. And so it was kind of very fitting of the time. It's a game that kind of really was a product of the influences that were kind of steeped in that time. So I think in that sense, we look back on that fondly because it represents that particular time period in which there was a particular style, to anime and to the games and movies influenced by anime, which I don't think it's the same anymore. There are influences, but they're not the same sort of influences. But I don't want to take away too much, from Grim Fandango. So let's jump over to Grim Fandango a little bit without having too much backlash. Strilly, what do you think makes Grim Fandango special, and why do you think people remember it so fondly?
Actually, I'm not really sure if people do remember it that fondly. I don't hear many people talk about that game a lot. There are many other adventures, point-and-click adventures that people talk about all the time, like Monkey Island. But what I would say to that is that the setting was something entirely different. It didn't look like the typical film noir, but it really had all the other aspects. And that was unique. It may not have been the first game to do that, but it was certainly very unique to the point-and-click adventure genre and to the way stories were told back in the day. So I think that was the most memorable thing. And you played as a skeleton in a suit, so that was cool.
Yeah, I mean, and I like the idea of, yes, you are a Reaper, but you're also kind of a bureaucrat. So I like that juxtaposition of, you're supposed to be in mythology, this very spectral, powerful being. And the game kind of plays with that with the introduction where you kind of see him approach and he's, in the shadows and big. And then, he walks in, he takes off his jacket and he goes off, his stilts. And he's just like this guy that's kind of trying to sell, packages for traveling to the afterlife. So he's basically an insurance salesman. I really like that humor. It's something that it's very quirky. It's a game that has its very own identity, and we kind of saw its aesthetic in other, media, later on, much later on. You saw it in the Pixar movie Coco. You saw it in Guacamelee. The same Day of the Dead influence, and I think this was one of the very first pieces of media that actually did this kind of Day of the Dead aesthetic. And it's now kind of become, I'm not going to say a cliche, but a lot of, different creators have used it as their aesthetic choice. So I think that's probably one of the most intriguing parts and one of the most alluring parts of Grim Fandango. But what do you think, Geoff? What do you think makes this game special in the eyes of many?
Yeah, so I'm the same as Dennis a bit. It's not a game I hear of from many people talking. I think a lot of people of our generation, it was a game that you knew about. It definitely feels like a game that was towards the end of the adventure of the point and click, I guess, if you want to call that an era.
Yeah, it kind of
like
killed
the
it.
80s and 90s. Yeah, it felt like a bit of a final, not a final nail, but a bit of a swan song, right?
And maybe the last attempt to rise in this genre before everybody realized, okay, no one's interested in this anymore.
Well, I mean,
exactly.
I have a little bit of a different experience. I think that Grim Fandango, growing up, it was always spoken about as one of the very best examples and one of the very best adventure games, up there with Monkey Island. And I actually think that has changed in recent years, particularly due to the remaster. I think that the remaster allowed a lot of people to play it and not just go with what they had been told, and also with the benefit of time. And I think that has led to a kind of reassessment of Grim Fandango. And nowadays, you can pretty much get it anywhere for any system. You can play it on iOS. You can play it on Android. And I think that has led to a reassessment and a kind of revisionist history of saying, well, maybe Monkey Island really was the better game all along. Maybe Full Throttle really was the, better game all along. Or Day of the Tentacle, whatever the case may be. But yeah, I remember Grim Fandango being hailed as one of the best adventure games ever made. At least based on my readings of, Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro. But... Yeah, I do think that it was held in very high esteem. And I still think that a lot of people find it, very nostalgic. And I really think it comes down to the aesthetic. I really think that it comes down to the story.
Yeah.
Tim Schafer's humor is, peerless. I really think that Tim Schafer is one of the most unique voices in the industry, and I really hope that he continues making games. Because, a Tim Schafer game when you play one. When you play Day of the Tentacle or Full Throttle or Monkey Island, because there's a very surreal kind of Python-esque humor to it all.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, but then you get to that point where you ask yourself, if these are all the things that I like about the game, do I actually like playing the game? Would I actually just want to watch the damn thing? And to me, I'm kind of thinking you probably have the better experience if you just watch it, at least nowadays, because unless you're really fascinated with the idea of breaking your head and trying to figure out these puzzles, which, granted, a lot of people may be, into those sort of puzzles. I am not. I don't like kind of trying to figure out that adventure game logic, to it all. And so if what I enjoy is, Grim Fandango, the story, Grim Fandango, the aesthetic, I would rather watch a long play, and I would say perhaps it's even better that this gets turned into a series or something. I would love to watch the Grim Fandango TV series. It would be, super interesting and funny. And that's where you get to the question of, is it really good as a game? And we're going to get back to you on that. We're going to take a quick break, and then when we get back, we're going to talk about the critical reception and whether we actually think that Grim Fandango is a good game. So we'll be back. All right, fellas, and we are back, and we are still doing our best to make sure that we give Grim Fandango its fair shake. Geoff, do you think it's a good game?
If you like point and click games or adventure games, so whatever you want to call them, I have absolutely no doubt that it's a great game. I was thinking earlier, we were talking about the puzzles and the obtuseness of it all. And I was thinking, would I play it again today? So this is where I'm going to have to be brutally honest with myself. I've got a mirror in front of me, and I'm just looking at myself, going, right, it's about time I tell some home truths to my reflection.
And you also have to shave.
And only one person on the podcast can have a beard at a time. So I guess I'm going to have to shave it off for Dennis to remain. Hello. So basically, in the 90s, my brain was probably a bit more flexible. It could think a little bit more obscurely, and some of the puzzles I could probably figure out by a lot of trial and error. And especially like Monkey Island, where it's just the most random stuff you could think of is usually the answer.
Yeah.
But playing Grim Fandango, watching a long play the last couple of days, I'm watching some of the puzzles thinking I would never ever have thought of that. Like, that's not something I would have done. It would have probably taken me 10 hours to figure that out. And I'm not a stupid guy, but I'm a 35, nearly 36-year-old man whose brain is now cemented in place and is no longer able to think, obscurely. I'm very much like, I have a job which is facts. That's how my brain works, and it's just become a fact machine rather than a let's see if there's ways around a problem, kind of thinking. So I think if I was to play Grim Fandango or any point and click game from like scratch again today, I think after an hour I would just, my brain would just leave the room and go, it's all on you. I've got nothing to do with this. So that's kind of personal, but I can imagine people who love those games that this is a very highly regarded game. I can see it.
I think that's my cue, actually. if I may interject. And I really agree with you, Geoff. But I also think, because I had the same problem. I had Grim Fandango. I played Grim Fandango. Thought, like, what is this puzzle? Where is this leading? I don't know. I don't have any clue how to solve this. And then in the end, you end up checking the internet, watching a guide, or reading cheats and stuff, and going on about that. And then once you've done that with the first puzzle that you can't get past, then it makes it all the more easier to do it again with another puzzle where you say, I don't have time for this. I'll just check the guide, the walkthrough. And then you end up maybe just following the whole guide all the way through just to get on with it and to get over with the game. And then it ends up being, or you end up asking yourself the question, would I have rather watched this as a movie? And then today you have the opportunity to watch a long play. But then in Grim Fandango's defense, in my opinion, I think it really depends on your personal perception of these kinds of things. If you're really an adventure game nerd, then you probably get a knack for these things at some point. Once you've beaten a couple of those, then you think, it's probably that. That's so far off, it's probably that. And then it might even end up being that. But I also think that Grim Fandango has some of the most bizarre solutions for puzzles. So it just makes it really awkward and slow paced in terms of progression. Other games from that time, like Monkey Island, Full Throttle, also had a couple weird puzzles that I couldn't wrap my head around. But it really depends on how you do those. For example, these days, point and click adventures have experienced a renaissance. They are back. Not in a huge way like back in the day, but they still are back on the radar. And there are new companies who produce new, very clever and intelligent point and click adventures, cute ones and very, very artsy ones. And I'm all for that. And there are games where I just didn't have to look at a walkthrough. So in the end, to conclude this rant, I think it's just, it depends on what kind of game designer you are, or like what kind of puzzle designer you are, and how many people you will reach by logic, or how many people you will reach by weird trial and error and then make them happy, because I think there are less people out there who like weird try and error solutions than people who like logical solutions. But then again, logic is also subjective, so what gives?
Yeah, but it's kind of telling that, eventually the adventure genre eventually ended up becoming what, Telltale ended up doing, which was kind of more of a narrative of a kind of TV show in a sense, without a lot of gameplay, with not that much, if any, emphasis on the puzzles. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I do agree with you, Dennis, that there is some sort of adventure, genre that has kind of resurged, but it's not the same one. It's not one that has the same issues that we had back in the day. And I think a big part of it is that it has just evolved into something else entirely, what we now call like a walking simulator. I think there's a direct lineage between, the adventure games of yore to those types of games like Firewatch or Dear Esther or What Remains of Edith Finch. Games like that are more story driven than anything. And I think that's just because if you're going to tell a story and the story's going to be your focus, then why do you feel like you need to add something in order to gamify it if it's not going to really be a positive for the game as a whole? So I think nowadays people are more okay with not, implementing that sort of gameplay just to justify the game. Whereas back in the day, you kind of still needed to be a game, quote unquote. So I think it's just a very different perspective. But with that said, I mean, the game was well received. It originally received an 84 Metacritic. The re-release accumulated an 80 on Metacritic. In the case of sales, it did, it sold about 500,000 copies by 2012, which was not very good. And it was around 50% fewer copies than Full Throttle. So it was very much considered a commercial failure. And after this game, LucasArts released Escape from Monkey Island. But then after that, they had three adventure games in development, and all of them were canceled. So effectively, this was like the dying gasp of the adventure game genre. Whereas in the case of Metal Gear Solid, jumping over to the other end, it has a 94 Metacritic. It's generally hailed as one of the best games of all time, between that and Ocarina of Time, and very much a contender for, the eventual winner of this tournament. I don't think that's controversial, and it sold 1 million units in Japan, 5 million units in the USA and Europe, and that was considering that the sales expectations were quite low at the time. And the interesting part about all this is that both of these games received a remaster or a remake. In Grim Fandango's case, is the remaster kind of, particularly because the remaster is essentially the same game, now that it's detached from the times where we have actually been able to look back on what the adventure game genre was, and what it was not, or is it, just proof that the adventure game genre has not aged well and that, it really wasn't, as good as we remembered it? What do you think, Geoff?
When we're talking about games that are coming out now, so we're seeing the adventure games, they are being tweaked. They've got as I said, they got quality of life improvements, and they're far more accessible than the old LucasArts games were. I think what I really respect about the remake or the remaster, of Grim Fandango is it's the exact same game. It's got better lighting and some better effects. But I saw some complaints when I was researching this. People said there should be a hint system and there should be an autosave. And it's like, dude, if you want a hint system, just go and read a guide and follow the guide. Like, I don't see why people would want a hint system in a game where, you're getting it, you're going to have to be prepared to use your brain. And it's like, I've had the same sort of thing when it comes to like Dark Souls. People are complaining that it's cheap and that they should give you more hints that things are going to happen to you. But it's like, just get better, get good, use your brain, get engaged. So I really think that, Grim Fandango, or the point and click, though, that 90s era has aged. I don't think it's aged well. But that's coming from a standpoint of, I've played majority of those games. If I play them again, I'm just going to blitz through them really quickly because I remember the core puzzles. I like to think anyway. Day of the Tentacle I completed in a couple of hours, so maybe that was a good sign that my memory at least is okay. But the core mechanics of of Grim Fandango, I think are fine how they are. But in 2020 or 2015, I think it came out, I can see why people would think, this isn't as engaging as it was back in the 98.
What do you think, Dennis?
In terms of what a remaster should be doing to a game compared to a remake, which is basically building the exact same game from scratch, anew,
right,
in a completely new like engine, the environments look different, maybe different controls, as for example in Resident Evil 2, the remake. They did that. But for a remaster, I'm basically with Geoff on this one. So who needs a hint system in 2015 or 2020? I don't know, but there is the internet. If you need a hint, go check that there. And if you don't want to crack your brain with those puzzles, then don't play an adventure game, a point-and-click adventure game. No matter how difficult or hard to get those are. But in the end, it's they improved the tank controls, so you've got regular directional controls. That was good. Graphics look better. I enjoyed it. I played the remake and I enjoyed it. I still got stuck and I couldn't complete it, and I didn't watch a guide or check a guide to go on playing. But that's on me. So in the end, I think as far as the remaster goes, it's well done. And
and I think that it's a good remaster. I mean, it also includes developer commentary, which is something that I wish more games would do. I used to remember back in the day when you had DVDs, with extra scenes that, they would give you the commentary track. You could learn so much from that commentary, and I really think that games will benefit from that. And there are just a few that have that, and I think Grim Fandango, if you're going to have a remaster, which is going to be a polished, experience, that brings you the same game that you loved, but with, modern, up-to-date conveniences. I think, commentary goes a long way into kind of preserving the history of the game itself. So I think in that sense, it's a very good remaster because it does a lot to kind of preserve its history.
Yep.
So, going back to Metal Gear Solid, with the release of Death Stranding, we have now seen that Hideo Kojima is not on the pedestal that he used to be as much. I mean, Death Stranding was divisive, to say the least, but it still received, good scores. But do you think that, the legacy of Metal Gear Solid has kind of distorted our perception of, Hideo Kojima as a games director? The fact that this game was so influential and that it held such an important part in our history of games as a whole. Do you think that has distorted our perception of Kojima as a games director?
I don't think that this distorted the way we view Hideo Kojima. Actually, I think the contrary is the case. Metal Gear Solid has basically been closed. It's a book with many a chapter, and it has been closed by Kojima and Konami consensually, more or less. Not really, but they kind of went split ways, and this just was the end for Metal Gear Solid. And Death Stranding is something so entirely different, but it breathes the amount of detail and the amount of uniqueness that Hideo Kojima brings to making games, that it kind of still carries the legacy of Metal Gear Solid. Without Metal Gear Solid and everything that Kojima achieved with this franchise, with this series, Death Stranding would have never been able to be made. So in that regard, it didn't distort anything. I think it cemented Hideo Kojima's stand and his position in the media world. And people are they were like so excited to see what Death Stranding was going to be. And I heard different things, but I heard a lot of good things. And, for example, or especially I had a lot of unique and very special things. I was afraid that it was going to be just some kind of Metal Gear Solid in a different setting, but it was something absolutely different. And that's what I like about Kojima, and that he just moved forward and that he was now free to do whatever he wanted at that point in time. And so he's really the director that I think the majority of media nerds see him as.
What do you think, Geoff?
I mean, I've got an opinion on the kind of the cult of personality that exists around Kojima. And it's a really interesting question where Metal Gear Solid kind of falls into that cult. For sure, obviously he worked on games before Metal Gear Solid. Basically the Metal Gear games from the previous consoles that Konami were working on. And for me, Kojima and Metal Gear Solid are very much an intertwined experience, and I really felt towards the end, Kojima had had enough. Konami had enough. Obviously, we could probably do a podcast on Konami that would last 2 hours, and it's all conjecture, you know. It's all, I think this, I think that, whatever's going on over at Konami HQ. But what I think has happened is that Konami has now got no reins on him. He can go out and create whatever he wants. And I haven't played Death Stranding. I've seen a hell of a lot about it. I'm looking forward to playing it this year so I can have a final opinion on Death Stranding. But I definitely feel that Konami at least always could hold Kojima to account. And they could say, no matter what, your games need to make money. But you're spending far, far, far too much on this now. Like, you're going a little bit too far with this. We need something that ultimately is gonna make money. So I think the relationship with Konami, between Konami and Hideo is something that is very obscure and bizarre as it is. But I do think that when it comes to the public's image, the cult of personality around Kojima is so strong that it seems to have a life of its own, where he could produce a terrible game, but people are still going to think it's amazing because it's Kojima.
Yeah.
So I do think that he is protected by Metal Gear. Metal Gear Solid is never going to be considered a bad game, and his name is always going to be tied to it. And it's exactly the same. And Ozzy, I don't want to trigger you here, but it's exactly the same as Miyamoto and Super Mario Bros. Exactly. When somebody becomes so well known for some or one or two things, it makes it very hard for people to forgive. Makes it very hard for people to say something bad about them when later they do something bad. Yeah. And that could be seen across all elements of society.
Yeah, and I don't think that we need to get into this rabbit hole of Kojima, but I find it to be a very interesting answer, Geoff, and I agree with a lot of it, because we've talked about this outside of the podcast, but I think my point here with this question and the way I would answer it is that I think that Metal Gear Solid was just such a terrific and well put together experience that it kind of made us think that Kojima was much more of a mastermind and was much better. You know, I'm not saying that he's bad. He's really good, but as a game designer, it gave him free rein to do things that were not necessarily great from a gameplay perspective. And It is games like Metal Gear Solid 2 that when you look back on them, they're not that enjoyable. Or Metal Gear Solid 4, which is basically in many ways a movie. And like you said, Geoff, it allowed Kojima to get a pass for a lot of the things. And that's what I mean when I say it distorts your perception of Kojima, because I think that Kojima has not had, other than Metal Gear Solid 3, and that game still has flaws, has not had a game like Metal Gear Solid since. But we still hold him in such high esteem. And I think from a gameplay perspective, he hasn't produced a type of game that, gameplay trumps the story itself. I think that he has become much more focused in trying to produce a movie than necessarily creating a great game. And I think Metal Gear Solid 5 was probably the biggest deviation from that because it was so much more gameplay focused. But at the same time, that was also one of the ones that was most divisive with respect to the fan base. But that's kind of what I'm getting at. And it just kind of goes to say that, the original Metal Gear Solid was an excellent experience, and it had such a huge shadow over the rest of the industry. But I guess moving on, to Grim Fandango and kind of its legacy, is it telling that despite being considered, one of the better, or at least, exemplary games of the genre, Grim Fandango still, at the tail end of 1998 could not breathe life into the genre. After this, Tim Schafer went to found Double Fine Productions, and he created Psychonauts, which had the same humor, but it was also more of a game. So, Geoff, do you think that Grim Fandango just had a losing battle, or do you think that, maybe if another different game had come around, that maybe the adventure game genre could have survived?
Yeah, we've touched upon it a little bit during our conversation here. My feeling is that it was coming to a natural end. I think that the industry and this genre was very much relying on one studio or LucasArts to continue producing. And without knowing everything going on at LucasArts in the late 90s, I can't imagine that it was something that they could continuously pump out these type of titles. And I don't think there are many others. You guys might know of a few more than I do from the late 90s. I think Gremlin produced Normality. I think that was one that kind of suddenly springs to mind. But there wasn't a lot of other companies or developers who were making these games. And I think LucasArts was starting to wane. They were starting to go to more towards the first person and the kind of the more action games. I think is it Dark Forces, the Star Wars shooter they did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think those sort of games, I imagine they were seeing, okay, we love making these point and click adventure games, but actually the Doom clone is selling 5 times the amount. We better go where the money is. So I do feel like it wasn't a losing battle, but I just think tastes were changing. And I think that they were just on their own island a little bit, LucasArts.
Yeah. And, in my case, I think it's again, not to be a cop-out, but I think it's a little bit of both. I definitely think that the adventure game genre was on its way out. I don't think that there was a lot that could be done to change it. But let's say that something like Psychonauts would have been released instead of Grim Fandango that focused more on not only implementing the kind of adventure staples, but also moving it forward in a way that was modernized a little bit more. I still think that Grim Fandango, even though it was one of the first 3D games, 3D adventure games, using the Grime engine, which was the Grim engine, I still think that it was a game very stuck to its roots. It was still very formulaic in the kind of adventure genre tropes. And so I think that if you had something that would have tried to move the genre forward a little bit more, maybe you could have seen it survive for a little bit longer. But I think that Grim Fandango was still very much stuck in its ways, and it was still very much a game of the times. And I'm not gonna put the death of the genre on its feet, but
that's a bit harsh.
But at the same time, I think that maybe something else could have been released that could have done a little bit of a better job to prolong its life. Just because Grim Fandango was so, I don't want to say the word stale, but just so conventional in the way that it approached the adventure game genre. So, all right, let's take a quick break, and once we come back, we're gonna have a final say on this 2 games and how they stack against each other. All right, everybody, and we're back. and we need to close this thing out. And we've talked about both of these games, and these games have already had their say in the first round, so we're not going to drag it out too much longer. So I'm going to ask you, Dennis, if you have to take a look at these games and have to consider which one would you rather play nowadays and how do they compare with each other, which one would you rather play and which one do you think is the more important game?
I would like to play Grim Fandango to completion because I haven't yet, but Metal Gear Solid is most certainly the more important game. It is way more influential on not on every other game, but on the entire industry after its initial release compared to what Grim Fandango did to the industry, because Metal Gear Solid was kind of a start of a genre and of a way to produce and convey the whole video game world. And Grim Fandango was, as we all kind of agreed on, more or less the death of the genre. It's really, it's difficult because, as I said earlier, LucasArts is the one company that you would have expected the best games to come from. But then again, you had other companies still making point-and-click adventure games after its quote-unquote death of the genre. For example, Broken Sword. That came out a little later, and it continued throughout the next few generations. It was a silent game, no huge appearances in the magazines and stuff. It was popular and everything, but not groundbreaking. But it still kept the genre going more or less, and it was a good game too. And so I wouldn't even consider the whole genre to be dead. It was just LucasArts buried their own point-and-click adventure journey, so to say, which is sad. But on the other hand, these days you have things like Thimbleweed Park, for example, which is a game by Ron Gilbert, the other guy from LucasArts, who was a legendary point-and-click adventure game producer and game designing mastermind along the lines of Tim Schafer. He did Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken, and he made Thimbleweed Park. And this is a time capsule. It plays just the exact way as those games, Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken, played back in the day. So he made a hell of a job to create a new game feeling like you played the game 25 years ago, or even like 30 years ago almost. So that is incredible. And it's a really, really good game. I love Thimbleweed Park. And that's a better game than Grim Fandango. And it didn't need Grim Fandango to be created. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I get what you mean. And it's interesting that you find it to be a better game than Grim. It also has the benefit of 25 years of experience. But I have not heard the same degree of reverence towards Thimbleweed Park than I have towards Grim Fandango. So it's good to hear that you preferred it. Not necessarily because I think that's a good thing. It's just because, at the very least, it shows that, these experiences can be positive. These experiences can be enjoyable. So what do you think, Geoff?
For me, Metal Gear Solid, I prefer to play it any day of the week. I can't hide that. It's better than most games on the system. It's better than most games from that generation. It's better than most games from that decade. It's better than most games from that franchise. It's better than most games from any PlayStation. It's better than most games ever.
Yeah.
And I just want to point I love the irony that we're saying potentially Grim Fandango marked the death of the point and click, considering what the content of the game is. That only just dawned on me an hour and a half later that we were talking about that. I guess for me, point and click adventures, I absolutely loved playing them in the 90s. I absolutely loved it. Broken Sword, thanks for mentioning that, Strilly. So Broken Sword, that first one, it's still brilliant. I still play it on the iOS.
It's really exciting. The first one has a brilliant story.
Yeah, it really does. I completely forgot that. So thanks for reminding me that kind of held the torch for easily through the first decade of this century. Absolutely fantastic series. So yeah, Metal Gear Solid. It has to get the nods from me on all marks. It's Metal Gear Solid, right?
Yeah. Let me just put it this way. I have both Metal Gear Solid and Grim Fandango on my PS4. Grim Fandango will stay there unplayed, and if I try it, I will pull it up, try to give it a go, and then realize I don't like doing this. I don't want to kind of, bend my head sideways in order to try to figure out whatever they were thinking of, even if it's clever or if it's cute or if it's humorous. Whereas every time that I put Metal Gear Solid on, I will not be able to stop myself from playing. And that's just how I feel. I mean, if I were asked which one do I prefer to play, I mean, there's just no question about it. But when you talk about, which one had the bigger impact, I mean, Grim Fandango feels like a blip, if that. It's just kind of like it was very nostalgic for a lot of people. A lot of people enjoyed it. It kind of built the reputation of Tim Schafer together with other games like Full Throttle and Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle. But certainly a big part of Tim Schafer's appeal, in going on to create Double Fine was that he had games like Grim Fandango under his belt. I think that the aesthetic of it is timeless. I think the aesthetic is one of the most creative uses of that cultural, folkloric, Aztec, look. I think that the music is absolutely fantastic. Peter McConnell did a terrific job in composing a very jazzy and noir kind of soundtrack. Mm-hmm. I think that it has a lot of components that are quite excellent, but I think as a game itself, it doesn't really have a lasting impact. I mean, when we're talking about 1998 and some of the very best games came out that year, Grim Fandango may be a very good game in its own right and within the adventure genre, but at the end of the day, it just can't measure up to the massive influence of Metal Gear Solid. And at the end of the day, it's not even about the influence, because if it was just about that, then, this thing would be over quite quickly. It's really that out of the two, it's just the more enjoyable game. It's just the more impactful in terms of its story, in terms of what it does, and in terms of the feel it gives you when you play it. So, yeah, I mean, there's just no question. I think that, Metal Gear Solid demolishes, Grim Fandango in this particular matchup. But, that's not to take away from Grim Fandango's qualities. And I think that there are a lot of them. And I think that if you have the opportunity to, either play it or watch a long play, I think you're going to find yourself enjoying it. So, I think that kind of does it for, Grim Fandango. It kind of got here on a mulligan. It kind of got to this round because, hey, why not? Anything could happen. But, its road stops there. I'm sorry. It's kind of like Netherlands in the World Series, in the World Cup. It's a nice little story, but at the end of the day, there's a reason why you're the underdog.
It did well. It did well to get this far. Fair play.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that comes to an end. This round, this particular matchup, brings us to an end. Thank you very much for joining us. Dennis, where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram under my handle Strillivanilli. And if you want to read what I have to say about indie games in the German reviews that I write for Welcome to Last Week, please do so. Google Translate is a fairly okayish method for non-German speakers to read my articles and Benya's articles, who also has been on the podcast. So Welcome to Last Week would be the main outlet where I talk about indie games. But otherwise, Strillivanilli, talk to me.
Well, that does it for us. Geoff, we can find you on Instagram as well. G-Spot Gaming. You can find me at Shadow the Collector with periods in between. But as a podcast itself, you can find us on our website, regionfreegamers.com. You can find us on Instagram, that's Region Free Gamers Podcast, and also on Twitter, Region Free Gamer without an S. And so with that said, I forgot to mention this, but please make sure, if you like what you hear, go and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps us, and it goes a long way toward, keeping us, invested in the whole project. And also, if you can subscribe, download our prior episodes. We have a huge number of them already, way over dozens of episodes. So, and also engage with us. It's also great to just speak with all of our listeners. So we're really looking forward to that. So that kind of marks another episode of the King of Games 1998. So we will see you again in the semifinals. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you had a great time listening to us.
Peace.
Thanks for having us.